In the last video, I introduced you to Jim, who showed us and talked to us about some of the more notable sites in and around downtown Gary. If you haven't seen that video, I'll just say you missed out on quite a bit. But don't worry, the video's on YouTube to stay and you can always check it out through the link down below. In this video, we're going to talk about how Gary rose to being the largest company town in America. But first, let's do some sightseeing in the Midtown area. This is Midtown on the map. Technically, Midtown is west of Broadway and the Pulaski neighborhood is east of Broadway, but we're going to sightsee the whole area. First up, the Jackson House. The Jackson House by far and away is Gary's most sought-after attraction. It's fittingly located along Jackson Street, though it's named Jackson Street after the former president, not the Jackson family. When looking at a map, you'll notice that the next street over is Monroe Street, then it's Madison Street, then it's Jefferson, then Adams, then Washington. And when you head west, it's the same thing, so there you go. It's hard to believe that 11 people once lived in this teeny tiny 4-room house, but that's exactly what happened. The Jackson family lived here from 1950 to 1969. As you can imagine, they all moved to California following the success of the Jackson 5. Crazy to think, though, that their music career started right here in this house. Joe Jackson, Michael's dad, moved the family to Gary after getting a job at Gary Works, just one of tens of thousands at the time who did the same thing. Back then, Gary had over 150,000 people living within, making it a thriving blue-collar city. Though, not without its problems, and we can get into more of what those problems were later in this video and in the next video. Well, as always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Doing those things will help the algorithm push this video out so this video gets seen by more people. Thanks. Right next to the Jackson House is the now abandoned Roosevelt High School, one of the more historic high schools in all of Indiana. And not just because 4 members from the Jackson family went here. What up, Jackie Jackson, Rebby Jackson, Tito, Latoya? But for much deeper reasons. Built in 1930, the school was only one of 3 schools across all of Indiana that were built specifically for black students. The city built it after white families protested the attempted integration of Emerson High School, which had briefly admitted a handful of black students. At the time, Gary had a large growing black population thanks to the steel industry, which offered opportunities for the newly freed families migrating north from the south. Many of these families came from generational poverty. They were shut out of opportunity to better their lives, but the mills in Gary, just like the factories in other Rust Belt cities, offered a chance for black families to change their life trajectories. These factory jobs didn't require a degree, they just required a willingness to work hard. Well, anyway, back to Roosevelt High School. The school closed in 2019 following a pipe burst during the winter. Costs to repair the plumbing were going to be around $15 million, and the school district couldn't afford it. Not too long before me uploading this video, there was a block party, the 2300 Jackson Street block party to be exact, where Marlon and Jackie returned to Gary. It took place at both the Jackson home and at Roosevelt High School, where over 1,000 were in attendance. As many as 65 food vendors were present, and the city was praised by the residents for holding the event. So that was a great thing for this community. Look, there's a strong desire among the residents to preserve Roosevelt High School. There's been moments of volunteers from the community who have come in to clean things up at different times throughout its closure. The goal is to not let it fall into disrepair like some of the other schools due to its historical significance. Notable alumni doesn't just consist of the Jackson family, but several athletes as well. Several Olympians, NFL players, MLB players, NBA players, and other entertainers once roamed the hallways here. So hopefully something can be made of this high school. Maybe it could be a museum of some sorts. We'll have to wait and see. Speaking of abandoned high schools, this is what's left of Emerson High School. Not technically in Midtown or Pulaski, but it fits the current topic. Emerson High School was the first high school in Gary, being built in 1909. Due to its declining enrollment, it closed in 1981 before reopening as a magnet school. By 2007, the school had deteriorated so badly that it was making school staff and students sick due to an abundance of mold. That led to another closure in 2008 when the school closed for a month while they attempted to get rid of all the mold. But after a month, it was determined that the cost to fully clean up and repair the building to make it safe for use again was too much. So despite spending millions to clean things up over a month's worth of time, the school closed for good anyway. Since then, the building's just been sitting here and rotting away, and at times, catching on fire. In 2023, the second of two major fires to break out in this building occurred. Back in 2015, there was also an infamous crime that occurred here when a 17-year-old girl's body was found inside. To this day, the murder remains unresolved. As I alluded to earlier though, this school has a detailed history. Back in 1927, the school was famous for its anti-integration protests being held by white students. At the time, Gary had one of the higher percentages of black residents of any northern city, with that percentage being 9.6%. While that's a far cry from today's 76%, back then, that was considered to be a high amount. By 1930, that percentage rose to 17.8%. But during those days, racial tensions were like nothing that we see today. Black students were protested against by white students as they didn't want any diversity at Emerson High School. As this article from Discover Indiana History puts it, white students feared not only physical contact with black students, but also white students felt like black students didn't deserve the same support as them. Anyway, the strike occurred in 1927 after 18 students were transferred from the all-black Virginia Street School to Emerson High School, as the Virginia Street School was overcrowded and was falling into disrepair, which once again led towards the creation of Roosevelt High School. Back in the direction of Roosevelt High School is another abandoned school. Here, Gary resident David Gearman tells us more about it.
Behind us is Beckman School. It's been closed for approximately 21 years. The land has been recently purchased, and a developer coming in and wanting to put a 261,000 square foot multi-use facility for light industrial warehousing. There was some opposition locally with some of the residents. I personally feel a project like this is good for Gary. I wasn't 100% sold on the location. There is a neighborhood around. And speaking to some of the neighbors, the reason they were in opposition, 21 years, that's a generation. This is all they've known. And of course, most people are the fear of the unknown. Do I wish this went somewhere else? Sure. But it is development coming to the city that we desperately need the tax revenue. This is just one of many schools that have been abandoned. We're under 4,000 public school students. At one time, the city of Gary had over 30,000 public school students. So there's a need to take this the valuable land and have basically the city invest in other businesses to come in to create the really valuable, the needed tax revenue that we need in the city. So I completely understand the fear that the residents around here have, but because that's all they've known. This is 21 years, as you can see, of an abandoned school, crime, dumping, murders. So, it's something we need, and it's going to take tough decisions, but I look at it this way. It's taken Gary through the downturn of the steel mills and other industries about 55 years to get here. I truly believe that it's going to take us about 20 to 25 years to get out of this. But what I see right now, the city, I believe the bleeding has stopped. The population loss is slowing down. And it's a realistic figure for I would say 20 to 25 years. I picture, and I kind of correlate it to Detroit. Detroit had 2 million at its peak. Gary had 200,000 at its peak. They're very, very similar. Detroit is turning, Pittsburgh is turning, and there's no reason why the city of Gary can't start turning. I invite young adults, young professionals to come here, you can truly make a difference in the city. Invest in us, we'll invest in you, and let's get Gary working.
So Beckman is just one of the many abandoned schools here in Gary, but as David said, rezoning for this school property has been approved by the city council for industrial use. That's industrial use as in warehouses, not lead smelting plants. Anyway, many of the other abandoned school sites in town have no plan and are just sitting and rotting away. That being said, we'll have to wait and see if the plans here actually come into play at the old Beckman school. Only time will tell. I mean, I've said this in my first Gary video, and I've said this in other videos where I go to struggling cities. I've seen way too many announcements for redevelopment projects where there's all kinds of excitement at first, but then nothing ever happens. It seems like there's more momentum to get something done here at the Beckman site, however, than, say, Emerson? So that's good news at least. Look, I agree with him that having something here that can generate tax revenue is better than having nothing. That's the only way to turn things around. You're certainly not going to be able to build luxury condos at the Beckman school site. I mean, maybe some affordable housing, but then the question is, would all of those units get filled? Are people looking to move into Gary? Well, next on the list, the city should try to renovate the Broadway corridor. I already showed you what it looked like in downtown, or between 11th Avenue and the Toll Road in the last video, and this is what it looks like from the Borman Expressway heading north towards 11th Avenue. And while we're here, let's start talking about how Gary was initially founded and how it grew into being such a large city. Believe it or not, Gary wasn't even close to being one of the first cities in Lake County. On this 1874 map, you can actually see a place called Tollston, founded back in 1857, long before Gary ever existed. But Tollston would eventually get annexed by Gary later on. Then there's a town called Casella, which eventually was renamed to Indiana Harbor, and then was destroyed as the now Indiana Harbor Works steel mill in East Chicago sits on that land. There is also Clark, another town Gary eventually annexed. Most of it is gone now, but if you look at where the far east end of the airport is, just north of the Calumet River is where Clark used to be. There was Middleton, Gibson Station, and Pine Station, which were all pieces of the puzzle that time and industry erased. Meanwhile, Hammond was just a tiny dot straddling the Indiana-Illinois border. There was even a place called Sheffield, which is now a part of Hammond. There was Hessville, which is also a part of Hammond now. And if you look closely, there's something called Indiana City on this map. But despite that, Indiana City was never built. Hobart existed, Lake Station existed, Liverpool existed, but Gary?
Nope.
Not in the 1800s. Initially, the region was mostly made up of German immigrant farmers and railroad workers. Things were quiet on this side of the state line. There were just fields, small towns, and the occasional train that you would hear in the distance, while Chicago? That city was busy turning itself into the railroad capital of America. Well, then in 1905, everything changed. The demand for steel out west was booming, and railroads kept stretching further across the country, so U.S. Steel looked around and said, where could we absolutely destroy the natural landscape and call it progress? That's when they landed on the southern tip of Lake Michigan. It was perfect. The lake provided endless water for the steelmaking process, ships could come and go easily, and all the major rail lines heading into Chicago passed right through the area. Basically, it was prime real estate for any kind of massive manufacturing operation, but U.S. Steel got to it first. What also made this location perfect was that all of the ingredients for steel were right nearby. Iron ore came from northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, shipped straight down through the Great Lakes. Limestone, mined in Michigan. Coal, dug up in the Appalachians and hauled in by rail. And this part's hilarious. Even back in 1905, according to discoverindianahistory.org, the property taxes were a deciding factor in U.S. Steel picking Gary over Waukegan, Illinois. So yeah, you could say that Gary was literally founded because the taxes were cheaper in Indiana than in Illinois. Some things never change. Maybe the high taxes in Illinois will even be the spark for a Gary comeback one day. We'll just have to wait and see. What would become Gary Works began construction in 1906 on what used to be beautiful sand dunes along Lake Michigan. Behind those dunes were thick grasses, old-growth trees, and miles of swampland. You know, actual nature. But U.S. Steel didn't want nature, they wanted steel, so they leveled the sand dunes, drained the swamps, and even moved an entire river. The Grand Calumet River was shifted roughly 1,000 feet south from its original path, just because it was in the way. But the natural destruction? It didn't stop there. They filled in part of Lake Michigan itself to make room for the mill. 2 giant piers were built stretching half a mile into the lake from the harbor for arriving ships. A 23-foot deep channel was dug with a turning basin at the south end, all done with the help of horses and mules. You know, standard equipment for building the world's largest steel mill, right? Well, after 2 grueling years of construction, the job was finished, and Gary Works became the largest steel mill in the entire world. This 1906 map was created right after Gary was formed. You can see the massive area labeled U.S. Steel, about 10,000 acres, with 4 industrial uses only printed in bold letters across it. Just below that, it reads Steel Company's Subdivision, and when you zoom out, the entire area is stamped in the giant words that read Corporate Town of Gary. The name Gary, of course, coming from the chairman of the board of U.S. Steel at the time, Albert Henry Gary. The first iron ore boat arrived at Gary Works in 1908. The boat arrived from northern Minnesota. It had to travel across Lake Superior and then south down to Lake Michigan to arrive, and it carried the first of what would become seemingly an endless flow of iron ore. By 1912, all of the natural sand dunes had been leveled, all of the swampland had been filled in, the harbor had been completely dug, the steel mill was fully operational, and a brand new industrial city was carved out of what used to be lakeside wilderness. On the city side of things, the first stake was dug into the sand at the future site of 5th and Broadway for what was to become the city of Gary. Today, there's the 5th and Broadway Park at that location, which I showed you in my first Gary video. By the way, the idea of 5th and Broadway Avenue being the main streets for Gary wasn't random. It was U.S. Steel paying tribute to its original home, New York City. Well, shortly after that, the Gary Land Company was established, and it started to lay out a grid network of streets around the intersection. Broadway was to be the main street, which would be zoned for the prime business area, while the east and west streets would connect residential zones to the business district. Sounds simple enough if you ask me. Seems like Gary could use some of those geniuses from 1906 for a complete rebuild today, huh? Well, the eastern border of the first subdivision was Tennessee Street. The southern border was 9th Avenue, and the western border was Fillmore Street. The first building constructed was shared by the post office and the Gary Land Company. You can actually see the building today on the north side of 4th Avenue near Broadway. While the city was being built, steel workers had to live in temporary housing, or shacks, that weren't really all that great to live in year-round. Construction of several businesses then begun along Broadway, including some churches, the city municipal building, and the first school. For the first 3 years of the subdivision's existence, U.S. Steel handled housing through a contract system. A worker could purchase a single lot, but they had 18 months to build a home that was up to par with U.S. Steel standards. If the employee failed to complete the construction, U.S. Steel would take back the deed. So not only did the workers need to complete a 12-hour shift 7 days a week, but they also had to build a house from scratch in their free time on an 18-month deadline. Since that wasn't sustainable whatsoever, the Gary Land Company then stepped in to build and sell houses directly to the workers, which was a much less miserable system. The company ended up building 206-room houses on scattered lots east of Broadway, 94 houses in the northwest corner of the first subdivision that were made up of 4 to 6 rooms each, and then 54-room homes made of wood in the northeast corner of the first subdivision for the lowest paid workers, who were mostly made up of immigrants. In fact, the Gary Public Library's caption actually calls these double dry goods boxes, which sounds like an insult, but actually, it was pretty accurate. All of the houses had this bland, square-shaped design with flat tops and were less than desirable to live in according to everything that I've read about them. As the mill kept expanding, families from all over the country began pouring in. The closer you lived to the mill, the more valuable the land became. But that early prosperity also exposed a major issue, which was segregation. The first subdivision stood in sharp contrast to the housing that was built south of what was then the Wabash Railroad tracks. Housing south of the tracks was built mostly for immigrants, reinforcing the idea that from day one, Gary was a city divided. By 1910, most of the construction for Gary's first subdivision was complete, and the city's population had already reached 16,802. Not bad for a city that 10 years prior was just a boggy swampland and a patch of dunes. At this point, 49% of Gary's population was born outside of the US, and 71% had at least one parent who was born outside of the US. Gary quickly became a melting pot of cultures, much like other early industrial cities that sprung up as being major manufacturing hubs. While things kept moving along, Gary kept growing, and more workers poured into the mill and the surrounding community. But on September 22, 1919, things took a sharp turn. The steel strike of 1919 hit mills across the country from Chicago all the way to Pennsylvania. Around 350,000 steel workers walked off the job nationwide. Most of those who were striking were the lowest paid workers, many of them being recent immigrants from Europe. They wanted the basics. They wanted better pay, fewer hours, and safer working conditions. And they had a point. The mill was dangerous. So dangerous that U.S. Steel had to operate its own hospital on site. Many workers were injured or killed on the job, and the air inside the plant was so polluted that workers didn't know what would give out first, their shift or their lungs. Plus, workers averaged 66-hour work weeks in those conditions, split into 12-hour shifts. In Gary, over 50 nationalities were represented at the mill, with Polish workers making up the largest group of immigrants. When the strike hit, about 85% of Gary Works employees refused to work. In response, Elbert Gary then ordered more than 30,000 African Americans from the South to take place of the workers on strike. These were non-union replacement workers, and U.S. Steel tried to keep them separated from the strikers, hoping to prevent these replacement workers from joining the union, but that didn't work. As tensions escalated, strikers filled Broadway and protests got to be intense. The mayor of Gary responded by calling in 7 units of the Indiana State Militia to enforce martial law. Public rallies and picketing were then completely banned. Once federal troops arrived to take over in Gary, the Indiana militia moved west to help control the scene at the Indiana Harbor Mill in East Chicago. The strike dragged on for a little over a month in Gary, but nationwide it lasted about 4 months. With no paychecks coming in, workers simply couldn't hold out any longer. But still, their efforts weren't wasted. By 1923, the demands they fought for, especially the 8-hour workday, finally became standard across the industry. Additionally, the 1919 strike permanently changed the demographics of the region. By 1930, Gary, East Chicago, and the rest of Lake County had become one of the most ethnically diverse areas in the entire country, even though Gary never became one of the major cities in the country. Yet, somehow in just 24 years, Gary's population went from 0 in 1906 to 100,000 in 1930. Elsewhere in the community, the Emerson strike of 1927 played a major role in shaping Gary's future. I mentioned this earlier, but I'll mention it again. White students protested against the integration of black students into their school, which ultimately led to the creation of Roosevelt High School, one of only 3 all-black high schools in the entire state of Indiana at the time. Emerson was located on the northeast side of the city and was mostly served by Gary's middle-class and elite skilled workers. And when you look at the map, and when you remember everything that I said about where the white residents lived versus where immigrants and African Americans lived, it all lines up. Roosevelt was built south of the tracks, while Emerson sat just blocks away from the steel mill. But that wasn't the only school strike in Gary's history. Another major one happened in 1945. At 15th Avenue and Madison Street stood the Froebel School, which today is nothing more than a large open field with a historic marker. The Froebel School was originally considered an experiment in school integration, and it served students from diverse backgrounds, at least on paper. In reality, black students were excluded from many extracurricular activities and facilities well into the 1940s. They could play on sports teams, sure, but they weren't allowed to swim in the pool until the day before it was cleaned. They couldn't take pictures for the yearbook, and their prom? Completely separate. Well, then came 1945. Hundreds of white students walked out of Froebel to protest the presence of black students at their school. At the time, roughly 40% of the student body was black. The striking students demanded that Froebel either became a white-only school or that they would be transferred to schools that already were. The walkout spread to Tolston School, and between both schools, over 1,000 students participated in protests that year. Gary's mayor eventually stepped in, ordering all students back to school under the threat of legal action against their parents. Students at Tolston returned, but those at Froebel held out for nearly 2 months. In the end, the Froebel strike forced the city to adopt its first official desegregation policy, even though discrimination still persisted in many forms. It wasn't until 1949 that the state of Indiana passed a law requiring all public schools to desegregate, a change largely sparked by what happened right here in Gary. By 1960, Gary hit its peak population of over 178,000 people. The steel mill employed over 30,000, Broadway was one of the largest and busiest shopping corridors in all of the Midwest, lined with theaters, department stores, restaurants, and crowds of people were seen everywhere. Basically, Gary was living up to its nickname of being the city of the century. Until it wasn't, because the second half of the 20th century would be a very different story. We'll get into all of that in the next video.